Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Sunday, July 17th, 2022, and today we're going to be talking about the state of Iowa and the upcoming Senate election that will occur this November between incumbent Republican Senator Chuck Grassley, someone who's been serving in the United States Senate since 1980, and his age will be a very important factor and consideration in the topic of today's video, and also Michael Franken, a former U.S. military, admiral in the military. We can actually check out here. I want to make sure that I'm getting the labeling correctly. A former or now retired U.S. Navy admiral and former aide to U.S. Senator Ted Kennedy. So this Democratic primary was an upset, at least to many political pundits, because this Democratic primary occurred between Michael Franken and Abby Finneker. Now, Finkenauer. Hopefully I'm saying that correctly. I haven't had much practice saying it. But if you remember her, she ran for Congress in 2018 and won, flipped that congressional district from red to blue, and then lost it in 2020 to a Republican. Now, she decided to run for Senate. She raised about $4 million to Michael Franken's $3 million, and the primary ended up in a position where there were many endorsements that were crossing back left and forth, but then by the end of it, what we found was that Michael Franken ended up defeating his opponent by about 15, 16 points. So a substantial primary victory in a race that nobody really expected to go to Franken, but looking at some of these numbers, I can't say the Democratic Party would be entirely displeased. Now, the reason why we're making a video talking about this is for two reasons. As I mentioned, Chuck Grassley is old. And when I say he is old, I don't say this as a negative way of referring to him or anything similar to that. What I am saying is that he has been in politics for a third of the state of Iowa's history. Meaning, if you take the length that Iowa has been a state, Chuck Grassley has been serving in some capacity in Iowa politics for a third of that entire time. So if that gives you a better understanding about where we are, he is one of the most senior members of the United States Senate. He has been in the United States Senate for over 40 years, and should he win this term, that will go on to nearly 50 years, which means there's going to be something here that voters aren't exactly going to be super thrilled about, which is exactly what you're seeing happen in this most recent poll. Now, polls themselves aren't individually enough to make me want to make a video about them. There definitely is a lot of information to unpack within it, but I will say that in this case, another big determining factor as to why I am making this video about one singular poll is because this is the most accurate pollster in Iowa politics in recent history, Trump era or not. In 2016, the polls said that Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump were going to be close in the state of Iowa. At one point, they had Hillary Clinton ahead across the state. But in the final three polls, we found that two of them were outside their margin of error. Emerson College said that Trump was going to win the state by about 3 points. He ended up winning by 9.5. And then Loras here said that Clinton was going to win by 1 point. She ended up losing by 9.5. Either way, these polls were off by a margin of about 7 points or 11 points, depending on the one you're taking a look at. But the closest one, and the one that was actually within its own margin of error, was the Des Moines Register. Now, again, this happened in 2020. When you take a look at the Iowa polls for the 2020 presidential election, what you found was that, let's go ahead and just jump over here, jumping over through the hyperlinks. The Iowa polls said that the race was going to be very, very close. But yet again, one pollster in specific really did and outdid itself again by predicting that Trump would win the state by about 7 points. The margin being 8.2%. Taking a look at this, public policy polling said that Biden was going to win by 1. It was off by 9. Insider Advantage, a Republican pollster on some cases, said Trump would win by 2. He won by 8, a 6-point margin off. Emerson College, again, off by 7 points in the state. Quinnipiac University, off by 7 points again. But the Des Moines Register, correct, and got that label, which allowed it to be an A-plus rated pollster in Iowa politics. And when you take a look at Iowa numbers that have been polled throughout the state over the past few years, you find that they tend to be very accurate. They are predicting that Donald Trump would defeat Joe Biden in a rematch in Iowa by 11 points in November of 2021. I absolutely believe that, considering where we saw Virginia in 2021, where we saw many other states in 2021, and Joe Biden's decreasing approval across the United States. Taking a look at the numbers that they also polled from September of 2021, Chuck Grassley was up 18 points against the other Democratic candidate. Now that is reduced to 8 points. Sometimes they're off, though. They did predict on different occasions that Teresa Greenfield, the Democratic nominee for Senate in 2020, would win, but in their final poll, they still ended up being correct. They were right to expect that Joni Ernst would underperform President Trump. That happened. They were also right to expect that both of these Republicans would win. Again, that happened. They've been a little bit more off in the midterm elections. In 2018, you can see that in some of their polls, they found that Fred Hubbell, the Democratic nominee for governor against Kim Reynolds, would win by about 2 points. He ended up losing by about 3 points, so outside slightly of their margin of error, but nowhere near the level of incorrectness that we saw in 2016 or 2020 for practically every other pollster. And it's not as if they were wrong. At one point, they did say that Kim Reynolds was going to win, but in the final one, they were incorrect, and we have to recognize that. No poll is perfect, but this one is pretty close to being so. So seeing a new number showing that Chuck Grassley is in a somewhat competitive race really goes against exactly why the Republican Party wanted Chuck Grassley to run in the first place. Iowa has been competitive, but Chuck Grassley's seat absolutely never has. We can take a look at his electoral history. I would bring your attention over to the right side of the screen so you can take a look at the Republican versus Democratic matchup as we go through page after page. Chuck Grassley's most competitive election was his first one in 1980, when he won by 8 points statewide. You fast forward to the next election, he wins that margin. He wins with 66% of the vote. Next election, he wins with 70% of the vote. Next election, he wins with 68, 70, 64, 60, and it goes on so forth, enough so that throughout the entirety of his re-election bids, he has never won less than 60% of the vote in a Senate election. In his most recent election, he won by 25 points across the state. So when I see these numbers, and I'm a Republican operative, let's put myself in that position, and I see that Chuck Grassley is weighing whether or not he wants to run for re-election, realizing that he is getting pretty old, that he's been in Iowa politics for quite some time, you would push him to run. Even if that means that he's forced to retire somewhere halfway through his term, at least you'd get through this election without a competitive race. Chuck Grassley has practically reassured Republicans this exact Senate seat, despite Iowa being a very competitive state in many, many elections. You take a look at some of these years, Democrats were winning it on the presidential level or won it in the 2 years on the opposite ends of it. Yet, for some reason, and the reason being that Grassley was very popular, his approval was keeping him afloat, keeping his re-election bid numbers extremely high. This new poll that shows him with about an 8-point margin of victory over Michael Franken is taken in a state where Trump won by a larger margin than what this poll is telling us Grassley is going to win by. In addition to that, that approval rating has narrowed down to 46%. When polls were taken in the beginning of the Iowa Senate race, questioning voters about whether or not they wanted Chuck Grassley to run again, over 2/3 of voters said that answer was no. It's a very similar thing we see happening right now for President Trump and President Biden. Voters don't always want someone with quote-unquote more experience, which is synonymous with old age. Chuck Grassley can still very well be popular while being older, and voters could still very well vote for him while wanting him not to run initially because he seems to be, in their eyes, better of the two options. But at the end of the day, this new number from the Des Moines Register is a very close one, at least in Chuck Grassley's history, which means that he could be in for the most competitive re-election bid of his entire cycle, of his entire time in the U.S. Senate, his entire term, I guess, or the length of all of his terms combined. But I will say that an 8-point margin of victory isn't something the Democratic Party should jump on as a means of using this as an opportunity to win this Senate race. It just means that the race is going to be more competitive than before, and that Republicans aren't going to easily have as much of a victory in this state as they otherwise would have if this was 2016, 2010, 2004, or any election, including his first one in 1980. Looking at the history of Iowa, though, I also would say, even if Chuck Grassley wasn't on this ballot, that Iowa wouldn't be so competitive. But then again, I am also surprised by the competitive nature of Ohio in some of these election polls. Now, I think J.D. Vance is going to win the state of Ohio, considering President Trump won the state by over 8 points 2 elections in a row, and Republicans were able to lock it down similar to Republicans in Iowa in 2018, a blue wave year. But I will also say that the competitive nature of this state has surprised me. J.D. Vance will likely win, but Tim Ryan is putting up a good fight. If Democrats were putting up as good of a fight in Iowa, and let's say Republicans nominated the wrong candidate in Iowa this time around, it's very possible that Iowa could actually be competitive. But realistically speaking, it isn't going to be. Because in a year such as 2020, where Democrats won the national popular vote by 4.5%, Donald Trump still won the state by nearly 9 points. Taking a look at 2018, Republicans still won the governor election in the state of Iowa. They won it in 2016. They won it in 2014. Iowa isn't exactly this ruby red state, but it definitely over recent years has become a lot more red, a lot more conservative, and a lot less willing to elect Democrats. And that's become very apparent across our recent elections. Iowa, in any neutral year, would be a red state. Not necessarily red enough that it can't be won by Democrats, but enough so that Republicans could rely on it at least for the time being. That would only be exemplified by a red wave. I don't know if that's exactly what's happening following what this poll is actually telling us, but I will say that the Democratic Party should not reach for this seat, especially considering where we are nationally. If it was a blue wave year, Chuck Grassley could actually be vulnerable. Recognize where we are. Grassley won by 24 in his last election, 31 in the election prior to, but is only ahead by 8. And this, again, is an A-plus rated pollster. This is the pollster that got it right in 2020, got it right in 2016, despite every other poll getting it wrong and being extremely outside their margin of error. This Des Moines Register poll hasn't been twice, and they got that Trump effect correctly, which means we could probably rely on it for 2022. Now, again, I would still bet on a Grassley victory. I still very much expect him to win this race. But it is something to be said about the competitiveness of this. 1, for old age in politics, for all the reasons I've already described. And 2, maybe the Republican Party doesn't have as much of a grip on Iowa in a year where Donald Trump isn't on the ballot. I mentioned 2018 because Republicans did win there, but the margin here was significantly less than what Trump's was in 2016. Trump almost won the state of Iowa by 10 points in 2016. Almost won it by double digits. Iowa was more red of a state than Texas was in 2016. Yet Kim Reynolds, as the incumbent Republican, who in 2014 was on this ticket here, who ended up with the ticket that won by 21.8%, she fast forwards to this election, now running for re-election into 2022, and wins by only 3. Now, again, I understand that Iowa went to the Democrats on the House level, and it also was a blue wave year, but I will also say, and I would say this just to take it into consideration, that looking at the statewide vote, looking at the competitive nature of Iowa in the 2016 election, or rather lack thereof, I will say that Kim Reynolds did still underperform what she could have done, because she wasn't the only Republican governor running for re-election in Iowa. My Republican governor, Larry Hogan, in Maryland, a safe blue state, won by larger than her. Charlie Baker did the same in Massachusetts. Phil Scott did the same in Vermont. Chris Sununu in New Hampshire. The point being that if Iowa was as red of a state as Democrats or Republicans might hope under a Trump wave, it would not have been only a 3-point victory for Kim Reynolds. Just something to think about. So when we take a look at these new numbers between Chuck Grassley and Michael Franken, I am really moved to believe that in a blue wave year or in a mediocre year, this race could be more competitive. It's a long shot. It's out of the question at most for the Democratic Party, but I will say that this definitely tells us something. It tells us something about Iowa politics that means in other elections, it might be competitive. In that this pushback against older and more quote-unquote experienced candidates isn't something that will always carry you through your re-elections by large margins. There are senators out there that might be looking at this and saying, okay, I won my last election by 20, I won the last one before that by 25, but maybe it could narrow down the same way that Chuck Grassley's did. And I get it. Iowa has a much more diverse and competitive electorate than maybe neighboring states such as, South Dakota, maybe neighboring states such as Illinois for the Democratic Party. Definitely more diverse in ideology and thought in terms of political stance. But I will say that there is something to be read into this, and I'm sure many senators are going to see this as really something showing them that they aren't always going to be safe just because they're popular, or just because they have been safe in election after election after election after election. Chuck Grassley has been in the Senate for a very long time. And should he finish this term, he will be in the U.S. Senate for 50 years. Almost. It's a huge and substantial time serving in public office. And honestly speaking, if he was to serve out his full term, he might try to run for re-election. I say that comically now, but it might become a reality in 2028 if he is still serving in that position. Chuck Grassley and Michael Franken are in a race that is surprisingly more competitive than we expected it. Everyone, and I mean everyone, had this race as safe Republican. I'm going to wait for a little bit more data to be released before I change my overall ranking. No one else has changed their ranking, and I think that is the right move, at least for the time being. But if we get out closer and closer to the election, and we get more data from the Des Moines Register and other polling companies, because others have suggested that it has become more competitive, we can expect this race to change in ratings. I still think Grassley has the lead. I still think he will win. But based off the comparison of polls here and the most recent one that we have seen, it seems as if number one, Michael Franken was the right nominee for the Democratic Party, and number two, that Chuck Grassley might not have been. 2022 is going to be a very competitive year in the U.S. Senate. Every single race will matter. Every single bit of an allocation of resources, people, spending, whatever it might be, will have a huge impact on the outcome of control in terms of Democrats or Republicans in power in January of 2023. And we will see what happens this November. Iowa could be close. It might not be. We will find out. But it will be a very interesting and fun race to watch. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2022 Senate election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.